Hamilton Morris, my man. Good to be sitting across from you here. I think, as I was saying earlier, a lot of people have been looking forward to us having a conversation and talking about all the many copious substances available in the world for the human beings to ingest and allow our brain to meld with the chemicals and create some kind of magic or occasionally disaster, which I think probably we've both experienced.
Possibly, yeah.
Possibly. So one thing I got to say, man, is some of your episodes scare the shit out of me. Like the Haiti one, like I still kind of get nightmares about the Haiti one.
These are the deep cuts. This is old stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a long time ago. That was 2009. But yes, that was a very strange time. And it was really an amazing experience being in Haiti because you recognize, especially in these more rural parts outside of the cities in Haiti, how if you have a totally pervasive magical belief system where there's no semblance of the sort of rationality that you generally encounter in the United States, it really allows almost anything to be possible. Mm-hmm. So, when people read Wade Davis's book, The Serpent and the Rainbow, in the 1980s, a lot of people said this is total bullshit. There's no way this could ever happen. And I think that's a totally valid objection from the perspective of someone who's never spent time in Haiti. But, if you're just surrounded by people that believe in flying, that believe humans can fly, genuinely believe it, believe in resurrection of the dead, believe in possession of both positive and negative entities, right. Then just by virtue of that magical belief system, a lot of things that would otherwise be impossible become possible, at least in terms of what people will...
Well, yeah, I mean, the psychosomatic effects of belief are truly incredible. And, you'll see things that defy, logical Western empirical reasoning. For example, the guy who was eating the hot coals. You probably shouldn't be able to eat hot coals off of a fucking, they were like corn on the cob. They were like hot coal corn on the cob.
Right. Oh yeah, he was going to town on those. And or the flip side is that there's a lot of things that we can do and we're just too afraid to do it. You're drinking from a glass bottle. You could probably break it and chew up the shards and you'd be okay tomorrow and probably wouldn't actually injure you all that much, but you're not even going to do it because you don't want to risk it.
So you're saying we all could eat hot coal corn on the cob?
I think so. I
don't know, man. I might bet the don't side of me or you being able to eat that. I think there's a greater purview of belief onto the body than I think we probably give it credit. And those ecstatic states allow you to, signal different, bodily responses that can be explained. But I just don't think we extend that. You have to be in a particular type of state in order to be able to do that without creating the kind of panic in your body that's going to create the kind of injury that would normally come. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So then at the end of it, it's been a long time since that episode, of course. So, I mean, I think ultimately the conclusion is that the datura has scopolamine in it, right? And the scopolamine with the puffer toxin is kind of what creates this Haitian zombie effect, or the same thing. We've heard about that in Africa too, actually, right?
Right. Well, Wade Davis's basic idea was that it's sort of a number of different substances that are contributing to this effect. You have an initial zombification process that is mediated by the pufferfish toxin TTX. So somebody ingests this poison, it paralyzes them, and because they live in this magical belief system, or what he calls a different cultural matrix, then they truly believe they have died and have been resurrected by a sorcerer, because they're not thinking about it in terms of cause and effect and drug action in the ways that you and I might think about it. So and then after this person has been resurrected, then they are given scopolamine periodically so that they're kind of maintained in this zombified, subservient state. I didn't see evidence for either of those things when I was in Haiti, and I even had some strange experiences. I was on a boat with fishermen for a day, and I said, "Well, how do you prepare these puffer fish to remove the toxin? Because it's specifically the reproductive organs where the TTX tends to accumulate in the ovaries and the testes." And they were totally confused. They never even heard of a toxic puffer fish. It never had. I was trying to say it in different ways, and it wasn't registering as a possibility. They kept insisting this fish is never toxic. So, and I analyzed the zombie poison that I was provided in Haiti, and it didn't contain any kind of bioactive material that was detectable via GCMS. So, does that prove or disprove Wade Davis's hypothesis? No, it doesn't really. It's just one small ultimately sort of poorly conducted field research experiment to see if I could, find any independent confirmation of what he was looking for, and I didn't. But that doesn't mean that he fabricated what he said. It just it means ultimately that, assuming that he was being honest, and I will say that he's somewhat prone to, at the very least, exaggeration in some of his claims. But assuming that the basic premise is honest. It doesn't mean that it was happening all the time.
Sure.
It means that maybe one person did it, at least. And that I do believe is possible, that one person could figure something like that out.
Now, have you investigated the truth of the kind of those ideas of scopolamine being used to get people to go to the ATMs and empty out their bank accounts? And I think this was in Africa or somewhere else in South America.
Well, there's in Colombia,
and
the producer that I used to work with actually produced a very successful Vice piece about scopolamine that posited this idea that it's being used to manipulate people, enslave people, that prostitutes use it to zombify people and steal their money. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if it has happened. I do believe that it has happened. I don't think it's an epidemic. I don't think it happens frequently. I mean, this is one of the major issues with the way most journalists cover drug-related issues, is they find something weird and interesting, and in order to make it to justify reporting it to a large audience, they tend to suggest that it's a widespread phenomenon when it may be a very isolated thing. The same thing is also true of there was a thing that was being written about a few years ago in, I believe, South Africa, called flash blooding, where they claimed that people would take blood samples from people that had just injected heroin and then inject themselves with the blood because there was some residual heroin in it. Has that ever happened? Probably it's happened. I don't think it's a widespread epidemic in South Africa. I never met anyone in my time there.
You got to be really low on heroin to be going for that.
Well, because people are rational and it won't work. Yeah. And, something that truly doesn't work has a tendency to be phased out of popular use. I would say that there are some exceptions. Things like astrology are pretty persistent in our cultural beliefs. But yeah, for the most part, people are driven by things that produce results, and that wouldn't work. So I can't imagine that it would ever become that widespread. But of course, it's very sensational, and people love that sort of story.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know that so I've gone down to Peru and partaken in the many ayahuasca ceremonies and understood kind of the admixture plants, and the toé plant, which is a form of datura, which is that kind of droopy flower. It's mostly associated with sorcery, and in a small amount, it's sometimes mixed into the brew with good intentioned shamans, but in larger amounts, that's typically associated with like the more coercive side of things, where you're trying to compel a response rather than allow the medicine to do its normal work. And so I guess for me, it became more logical understanding that in that cultural context that the datura plant was used for more coercive action, whereas something like the chacruna and the opayahe and the wambisa and some of these other admixture plants, the ayahuasca, were more used in the medicinal context. So, but right. It's just interesting what the different psychoactive compounds, kind of allow and which way you can kind of bend them depending on the intention of whoever's providing it.
Right. Yeah, I think most people don't appreciate how versatile most of these compounds really are. You know, you watch something like that Vice piece about scopolamine and you think, oh, this is an evil, dangerous drug. It's the craziest drug in the world. And then I'll tell people, well, you know, that same exact drug is sold over the counter in antiemetic patches for seasickness because it's really useful therapeutically. It's the kind of thing that your grandmother might use before going on a cruise. It's not, you know, exclusively some sort of substance that's used to manipulate and enslave people by any means at all. Astronauts use it.
Right.
It's very useful. And on top of that, it's actually a very useful antidepressant. And when it's added to ayahuasca, the antiemetic effect could prevent people from vomiting, even though I know that there's a whole cultural association with the vomiting,
purge.
the purge, and the cleansing. But if for some reason that were undesirable, the addition of these tropane alkaloids would probably suppress vomiting to some extent.
It's interesting. Yeah, I didn't even really think about it in that way. I mean, I think a lot of times the shamans and the plant doctors they speak in terms of spirits rather than in terms of chemistry. But that's just their fundamental understanding. You know, that's just their paradigm by which they understand things, where we understand things in a different way. So they may describe it as, you know, a gentle spirit that warms the stomach, you know, or we're like, oh, it's an antiemetic, you know, with the isolated compound being scopolamine. It doesn't mean that one's right and one's wrong. It's just that one's one way to describe it and the other is another way to describe it.
Right. It depends on, you know, what the ends are, what you're trying to achieve. I mean, I had a really interesting friendship with this PCP chemist in Compton who tragically died when his lab blew up. But before he died, we would talk a lot about chemistry, and in some sense, he was a chemist in that was his job. That was where his money came from his entire adult life. He'd synthesized PCP, and it was his livelihood. But he had no concept of what a molecule was, had never taken a chemistry class, and didn't understand on a molecular level anything that he was doing. So he had this like folk chemistry understanding that I could see why he said the things that he said, because based on his observation of these reactions, it made intuitive sense if you didn't understand what's happening on an electronic molecular level.
That's pretty wild. So he just knew how to do it and then created his own legend surrounding it, which is pretty much what every indigenous culture has kind of had to do. You have these things that all of a sudden you mix them, you boil them, you do them, and you create what feels nothing short of magic. You know, when you're ingesting a lot of these compounds, how the fuck do you describe that? You know, if you don't have the microscopes and all the, you know, the analysis that we have available.
And even with the analysis, when it comes to actually describing the qualitative effects, we're no better than anyone else. We have no real tools. Maybe we have some surveys and things like that that can give a quantitative edge to the more mythological interpretations of the action of these substances. But for the most part, we're all doing the same thing. We're just describing what we experience.
Yeah, totally. And these experiences are so unique. It'd be like, imagine describing like eating too much wasabi or having an orgasm, like things that aren't drug related that are just crazy. Like it'd be really hard to describe that. And a lot of these different interactions with these psychedelics and plants feel in that category where it's almost impossible to adequately describe what you felt to another person who's never felt that same thing.
Even if they have.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Speaking of that, that Salvia ceremony that you went through was probably one of the more beautiful ceremonies I've ever seen. And it looked like it created a pretty unique and powerful effect. I mean, a lot of times people just smoke it and freak out. I remember I go to head shop shows and there'd be like a bag of salvia and it would just say panic on it and have someone clawing their face. Like that was how they were marketing it, right? But what you were doing, eating those rolled up leaves in like a really beautiful traditional ceremony, seemed to create a much, much different effect than your typical salvia effect. What was that like?
Yeah, it's really interesting because on one hand, I have a totally laissez-faire attitude toward most people's drug use. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do anything. So when somebody says, oh, you're just doing it just to get high, I think, well, how do you know? How do you know? You don't know anything about that person's intentions or what their internal experience was like. Don't dismiss another person's experience as just getting high just because they don't use the same words as you to describe it. You don't know anything about what they experienced. But
Preach.
So I try not to fall into that trap of saying, well, I do it in the right way and you do it in the wrong way and you have to do it respectfully and you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way, because there are no rules.
That said, if you're smoking something that says panic on it, there's probably a better way to do it.
But you might have a transcendent experience from
That's
that.
true.
I mean, when I think back to my own experience in high school smoking salvia, it was, in no way a prepared, responsible experience. I heard about it from a friend and they said, oh, there's this stuff, it's legal, it makes you trip balls for just 2 minutes and then you're totally back to normal. And I thought, that's interesting. And this is when Wikipedia didn't exist when I was in high school. Arrowhead was really the only source of information. It was not as even close to as easy as it is now to learn about something. So you wouldn't even go to the internet to look it up. It was just, it might as well have been the Middle Ages. And you go to a head shop and get a little bag of this stuff, and I had no idea what I was getting into, and I'd never used a psychedelic before, and I suppose that I was very lucky that for whatever psychological reason I happened to respond very positively to it and really enjoy and appreciate the experience. I can't tell you why that is, but it simply was the case, and I used it relatively frequently when I was in high school. And then around the time that I was in college, salvia had earned this reputation as a terror psychedelic that sends anyone that smokes it into a horrifying realm of, you'd hear these stories, oh, I felt like I was being strangled by barbed wire. I felt like someone was sandblasting my face. I felt like I was in a gears being ground infinitely.
Now, technically, it's not a psychedelic, right? It's a dissociative. Isn't that accurate as from a technical standpoint?
From a technical standpoint, it's a highly selective kappa opioid agonist, and whatever term you want to apply beyond that is sort of up to you. The word psychedelic is a nebulous word. You know it when you see it. You know it when you feel it. Do I think salvia is a psychedelic? I do. Do I think it's a dissociative? Also, to an extent, I do. I don't. It's pharmacologically different from any other drug that's in common use. So, in some sense, it warrants its own term, but that term doesn't exist. So it's salvia. So you're hearing all these horrifying experiences, and I started to realize, wow, I'm actually in a very, very small minority of people that appreciate this substance, and I don't know why, but people tend to respond really negatively. And in that sense, I do think there's something to be said for going back to the traditional context, because the way that I did it in Oaxaca, I think that it emphasizes the value of what you're doing. And a lot of times these things aren't necessarily spiritual. They're very pragmatic, very simple. For example, having a relationship with the plant. If you are given a plant by a drug dealer or you order it on the internet, you don't know what it looked like when it was growing. You don't know what kind of humidity requirements it has, how sensitive it is, what kind of insects eat it. But if you have to go find a plant in nature or grow a plant yourself, you develop an appreciation for that plant or that fungus or that animal. I guarantee it. And, I think anyone that eats mushrooms that they have grown themselves will have a totally different experience just by virtue of having spent so much time thinking about the mushrooms, thinking about sterilizing the grain, inoculating the grain with spores, watching the mycelium colonize the grain, setting up the humidity just right for the fruiting of the mushrooms. All of this gives you a connection to and this isn't some kind of hippie supernatural connection. It's just spending time with something in the same way that
you could almost say the mushrooms were grown with love.
They're grown with love. Yes, it's something that you've really spent time with, so you have an appreciation for it. So in the Mazatec Salvia ceremony, you have to go into the forest and find the plants, and you have to pick the plants in a certain way using just your right hand, and you have to roll them in a certain way, and all
use
this.
Tobacco to ask permission. That's kind of traditional in a lot of cultures.
They
didn't have that there in that one.
Not in that one, but there's a lot of mystery surrounding these ceremonies, and there's not a lot of documentation. So it's possible that other people in other regions of Oaxaca do it differently. And all of these things, when you boil it down, make you appreciate what you're getting into a little bit more because you're thinking about it. It's not someone handing you a bong at a party and saying this is going to make you trip balls for 5 minutes. Again, nothing's wrong with that. But if people are having negative experiences, maybe this different way of doing it that involves a prolonged period of thoughtful appreciation and preparation for the experience that you're about to have will really benefit the user.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so you go through that whole process. You start eating the rolled up leaves, and a feeling starts to come over you that seemed. I've never had salvia before. It's one of the ones that I've missed on the list. Maybe we should play psychedelic horse at the end of this and see. I'm pretty sure you're gonna win. But anyways, that's one letter for me because I've never tried that one. What was that? What was the experience? How did that feel? It seemed far different than a smoked salvia experience.
Well, it's interesting because it's very different yet very much the same. It's the best way to describe it would be to say that it is a smoked salvia experience that's extended, dramatically extended. So there's all these things that are rushing at you with a smoked salvia experience, and you don't have time to appreciate or contemplate the characteristics of any of them. It's analogous to ayahuasca and smoked DMT, where smoked DMT is a flash of insanity of everything you can possibly imagine. Ayahuasca is also a pretty dramatic flash, but at least it's extended enough that you can begin to appreciate the different components of the experience in a more careful way. So this is what happens when you chew the leaves. You start to realize, it comes in waves. It's coming in waves, and it's rhythmic, and it has this certain warmth to it. And I'm starting to sweat, and it's filling my body with this feeling like I've just exercised, and you appreciate each component, and relative to something like DMT, I find that the closed eye visuals are very simple, almost like a Frank Stella painting. These sorts of solid ribbons of color that are interweaving in a geometric way, and it's very, very beautiful. And I can say with certainty that this is a very good way to experience salvia. I think most people wouldn't want to get into it because they have smoked it and they say, well, if 2 minutes was like that, why would I ever want 4 hours of it? But
and that's how long the arc was?
It lasted over 4 hours.
Wow.
Which is really remarkable because I've chewed dried salvia leaves years before that experience, and it worked, but it didn't last close to as long. And again, I think that there's very small and subtle aspects of the way these things are done traditionally that have a really major impact. For example, something as inconsequential as drinking water. You wouldn't even think about it. Of course you drink water when you're thirsty. Why wouldn't you? Well, there's no water in this ceremony, and there's no water or very little water in Native American church peyote ceremonies as well. What is the product of not drinking water? Well, the material clings to the mucous membranes in your mouth, and you have the buccal and sublingual absorption that might be achieved in a different way than if you took a sip of water immediately afterwards to wash down the bitter taste of the leaves. So suddenly, my lips in the video are totally stained with chlorophyll.
Like the penguin.
That's a flattering comparison.
Well, just with the black coming off of his mouth, not anything else. But that's what it kind of reminded me of. Like it wasn't a flattering mouthpiece, but it was an incredible fucking example of somebody going through an ecstatic state that looked totally unique.
Right. Right. And again, like I said, I have this very laissez-faire attitude. I think, whatever, if you want to lay down, lay down. You want to be comfortable. Who's to say what is right or what is wrong? But I will say that there's certain uncomfortable things like not drinking water or not laying down or sitting in a chair and listening to someone sing in a way that you otherwise wouldn't, that will have very interesting impacts on the experience, will change things.
Yeah. Yeah, man, that makes a lot of sense. I think going through the hardship of it, they call it a lot of times trabajo, work, and making it, the intention of it being work, the intention of it being a little bit harder. Peyote ceremonies are particularly challenging. A lot of times you'll be kneeling for the whole ceremony. These physical obstacles can actually be a part of this process. Asserting your willpower, going for something intentionally at cost, certainly has an effect. Certainly has an effect with your mind, and also that it's not happening to you, that this is something you're intentionally going for. You know what I mean? And I think that's a lot of times where these things go wrong. It's like, why did I do this? What am I doing? This is the wrong place. So, all of these thoughts start to come in. Whereas if you, every step of the way, have traveled, have met, have found, are doing the ritual, you pretty much are ready at that point.
Right. Oh yeah. Intention is always a big part of it. And the other thing is dose. In our way of thinking about drugs, often we think that more is better. And one thing that I found very interesting about the way that San Pedro is traditionally used in Peru is that they intentionally prepare it in a less efficient way. If you are making a San Pedro extraction, you drop the cactus into a blender, you homogenize it completely, you add some acid like lemon juice, and you strain it, and you can extract most of the mescaline from the cactus pretty crudely and simply that way. But the way they do it, they slice it like a loaf of bread and boil those slices. That is, without question, not the most efficient way to extract mescaline, and it results in a tea that is not very strong psychedelically. But for them, that's not the point. The point isn't to travel to the far reaches of consciousness. It's a health tonic. It's healing. It's about rejuvenation. It's not about, total deconstruction of all components of your personality.
Right. Especially if you're drinking it every night, like those guys are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another interesting experience that probably there's not very many analogs to was when you ate all of those fish brains. And this was another one of those things where it was like, God damn, I couldn't do that. Like mad respect to you for just going in. I think you ate like 6 or 7 fish brains, and not really knowing exactly what was going to happen except for maybe night terrors. I was like, he is a brave motherfucker. Like, I've done a lot of crazy shit, but I don't know if I would do that.
Well, that's another example of something that's very prevalent in the anthropological literature, where you have reports of a plant that causes some bizarre vision, and you don't know if it's because of this magical framework that they interpret the natural world through, or if there's actually something pharmacologically active in that plant or in that animal. There's reports of, I believe, the bone marrow of giraffes causing visions, or there's reports of various ants having hallucinogenic properties, or all sorts of. There's quite a few, or various bioactive birds, and that actually is a real phenomenon. Birds that bioaccumulate various toxins from their diet. So it's hard to figure out what is, a projection of some belief about that organism, and what is actually a physical chemical component of that organism. And that was very true of these fish in Madagascar. I do believe, and did believe then, that there's something physical to it, because these sorts of hallucinogenic fish poisonings have been reported independently all over the world, in Hawaii, in Réunion, in Madagascar, in Mauritius, in France. So if so many different people across decades are reporting, and in Chile as well, I believe, are reporting this, then it seems totally plausible, especially given that there is such an amazing marine pharmacopeia of all these different often serotonergic compounds that are found in soft corals and algae and things like that. So why might it seems totally plausible. Why couldn't it happen? Why couldn't a fish accumulate some sort of bioactive compound that is thermostable enough to survive the cooking process, and people eat the flesh of the fish, and then there you have it. So it made sense. At the same time, I was a little bit unsure of what I was getting into, because you talk to people and they say, oh, it causes visions, but when they talk about visions, do they mean it the same way I mean it when I say visions? For me to say something causes visions, that's a big deal. It's not a subtle thing. But maybe for them, lots of things cause visions. Maybe, I don't know, a cup of tea causes visions, or they use the word visions in a different way. So it's really hard to say what happened. We analyzed the fish samples. The problem with chemical analysis of any thing like a fish is that there's so many chemicals in a fish. I mean, everything is chemical. Yeah. So, like, if you have all these amino acids, all these just, various degradation products of all of these things, just endless. I mean, literally tens of thousands of compounds. So who's to say what is what? And then with just one experience of me eating the fish, and I was very jet lagged at the time, it's impossible to conclude anything from it. But it's still so provocative. You know, I make these pieces because I want to learn about a phenomenon, but it's often, by the time I finish, I feel like I'm just even starting to identify the problem that I was setting out to solve.
Well, it's such a deep thing. I mean, you could study San Pedro your whole life and really still only scratch the surface of truly understanding that, or study ayahuasca your whole life, or psilocybin. You know, the levels just are like fractal almost, is how deep you can go with these different compounds and different plants as the interaction starts to change with the human mechanism as well.
Yes.
And that's the thing. And you see that. I mean, you see people who've dedicated their life to one or two different practices or plants, and, you know, they'll say the same thing. Like, there's always another layer. They're still learning. That's pretty, that's the unique thing about this. You know, whenever you think, oh yeah, I've got this, you know, no big deal, I've done all the plants, I'm fine, something else will come through and you'll be like, whoa, I don't know what the fuck I'm getting into. You know, like, this is a whole new territory.
Right, of course.
Yeah, which is interesting. So another one of the coolest moments that I can recall was when you did the toad ceremony, Sapo, the Bufo agaricus, the Colorado River toad.
Yeah.
And it was a gnarly juxtaposition of the guy right before you who had that really dramatic kind of physical, you know, explosion in the water. And it kind of freaked me out that they were having that in the water as well. Like, I didn't really understand why that seemed like extra risky to me, with like rocks and water and people thrashing around.
Right. Yeah, that was an interesting experience because I had gone to Mexico primarily to simply film the toads. That was it. I wanted to film them and talk to some shamans in the area. And then I'd heard about this shaman, Dr. Jerry, who is a gynecologist. And I thought, well, that's a pretty interesting story, that someone left gynecology to be a full-time toad venom shaman. I've got to meet this guy. And he immediately said yes, and said, and I have two people that are such beautiful users of this toad medicine that they're going to fly to Mexico with 1 day's notice on their own dime because they want to be a part of this project. And I thought, all right, well, these people are the masters. These people are really, really, really serious about what they're doing. But I had smoked 5-MeO-DMT maybe around 2008 and had a very, very negative experience. You know, I knew what I was getting into. I'd read, unlike the Salvia experience in high school, I'd read countless reports. I'd read T-Call. I knew that this was considered by many people to be the strongest psychedelic in nature. And I also knew that it had a potential to be toxic in a way that things like DMT don't. So I did know what I was getting into, and I didn't do it in a irresponsible way. It was a controlled environment. It was in my apartment. It was dark. I was by myself. There were no interruptions. But as soon as I smoked this stuff, it just went wrong. It went wrong immediately. And the feeling was what I imagine it feels like to simply be poisoned and be dying of a cyanide poisoning. Like every cell in your body is shutting down, and it's fucking terrifying.
Wow.
And
are you certain about the compound, like that it was clean and it was the right compound and everything?
Yeah. And I tried to reason with myself, at the beginning, and say, just let go. If you're dying, you're dying. If you're dying, you're dying. Just let go. There's nothing you can do. If you're going to die, then
it's pretty much sound advice for any psychedelic experience.
Right,
if you think you're going to die.
So you're dying, so die. But then it wasn't working. I couldn't do it, and I would return to this self-hatred of, you're a fucking idiot. You're dying for this? For just to use this Chinese chemical that came from the internet that was later analyzed and confirmed to be of the correct identity. But at the time, it could be something else. And what am I thinking? What was I possibly hoping to gain from doing this? What possible positive result could there have been from me doing this? Just cycles of self-hatred. and then came out of it, and I was okay. I was shaken up, but I didn't spend.
I think that's a huge difference between when you do something on your own that you don't know and when you're in like a guided ceremony. Like if you're with somebody who's a guide who's done this 1,000 times, like you don't have that doubt, like, what the fuck is this? Did I just do poison? Am I going to die? Like there's this constant reassurance that just removes that whole area of self-doubt, from your mind to a certain. You can still think you're going to die, but it's usually not that I got poisoned. It's usually something specific that's coming up, a vision that you have to work with or something like that. But when you don't know, then you're like, did I do too much? Is this the wrong shit? What the fuck is happening?
Right. And typically I'm not the sort of person that falls into those thought loops because I'm a very careful person. I weigh everything out very carefully. I analyze everything in a real way, not with some kind of colorimetric reagent, but with GCMS. And so I have a certain confidence that is really a luxury and a privilege to be able to know those things about what you're using. But this was, I believe, the chemical, not necessarily the circumstances, although I will never know because the two are sort of inseparable. In any case, my first experience was dramatically negative and frightening. So that's sitting in the back of my mind. And I'm the sort of person that tends to respond really well to psychedelics for whatever reason. Like I said, Salvia has been nothing but enjoyable and revelatory for me. So I started to think, well, maybe you should learn from the past. If you had a really negative experience with this, maybe that's a sign that you don't respond well to this chemical, and you're a fool if you don't learn from that fact. So what is wrong with you if you're going to go and do it again after that experience? But then at the same time, I'd keep hearing these stories that people would tell me about transcendent experiences where you're rocketed into the cosmos, surrounded by love, and it makes you a better person. And I think, well, that would be pretty nice as well. I think I could go for a little bit of that right now. And then on top of that, my friend Casey Hardison, who's an LSD chemist who was in prison for a decade and got out and was kind of going through a rough period, smoked 5-MeO-DMT with one of his friends while they were both drunk, and the friend asphyxiated on his vomit and died. And when my friend Casey came out of the sort of dissociative or whatever you call this experience, because you're not there for a little while, you're somewhere else. When he came out of it, his friend was dead, and that was it. So that's again, it wasn't a direct pharmacological effect of the drug, but the fact that he was drunk and had had a meal beforehand and wasn't being watched by someone meant that he died after smoking the stuff. So this is all in the back of my mind. Negative experience, friend of a friend just died smoking this stuff, and I was talking to the gynecologist shaman about it and saying, I have some major reservations. That line,
I hope that line becomes like a meme. I was talking to the gynecologist shaman about it.
And and I was saying, I have some really serious reservations about this because of a negative experience in the past and because of this tragic death of a friend of a friend. He was saying, oh, yes, it was so terrible that he died. No one expected that. And I was like, yes, no one expected. He was like, he was the son of a shaman. No one would have thought that he, of all people, would have died. And I was saying, I didn't realize that he was the son of a shaman. And he's like, oh, you're talking about the recent death in South America? And I was saying, no, I'm talking about the recent death in North America. There's another recent death that I don't even know about. So all this is putting me into a kind of agitated state surrounding using this venom. I'm genuinely uncertain about whether or not I'm going to do it. And then when the time comes, the person before me had that incredibly violent response to it where he was thrashing around, and from the perspective of an external observer, it looked like a negative and dangerous experience. I mean, a lot of people looked at that and thought that is totally undesirable.
And that happens, talking to, because I've worked with 5-MeO providers and shamans, and that seems to happen with a regular percentage of people. Like that's not a true aberration. Like that is like a reliable percentage of humans who have a very agitated physical response that can turn, just kind of thrashing and wild like that to a little bit more focused and like aggressive, and that's this weird thing about that medicine, just an interesting one.
Yeah. And so then watching that, I thought, I don't know. And, you know, of course, it's also very vulnerable to use these sorts of things on camera because you're exposing a part of yourself that even you don't know about. And, you're telegraphing it to millions of people who will judge you with nothing but the harshest imaginable criticism.
Yeah.
Who knows what sorts of things I might reveal in that state. And so I was really, you know, feeling a lot of conflicting emotions when I went to do it. And I was very afraid. And the experience ended up being so more positive than I could have possibly imagined.
Yeah.
And it was so positive that people didn't believe it was real, which was another thing that I could have never expected. You know, why on earth would anyone fake such a thing? Yet that actually became the predominant response. I was getting all these messages from enraged people saying, "Oh, I used to have a lot of respect for you, Hamilton. I had a lot of respect. And then I saw that you faked that toad venom experience, and all my fucking respect went out the window."
You know, it's funny is you were just lying there just saying love, love over and over again. And I remember really just smiling watching that because I actually have a recording of the time. It wasn't video, but I have an audio recording. And I was laughing and going, oh, fuck, oh, my God. And then I just started singing like, love, love, lovity, love, 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 love. It's just overwhelming feeling somatically where every cell of your body transmutes into that feeling of like capital L love. And you're like there in it, in this like love orgasm of your whole body, mind, soul, everything. And that was, you know, it seemed like I could see another fellow person going through that same thing because it was really cool to kind of watch that and draw the parallels between, you know, my own experience and watching what was coming through you, a person from a totally different background, totally different place, totally different, you know, situation. But it came back to that word and what that word fundamentally means and how we transcribe that as a symbol. It's really the only good way, you know, to describe what that feeling is.
Right. And it's so interesting because I do consider myself a very cynical person. I try not to be cynical, but it's my natural tendency. Sure. And, you know, the current ecological and political environment doesn't help all that much. So I don't think of myself as the sort of person that would say those sorts of things. I mean, it surprised me to see what had happened. I rewatched the video several times and kind of, you know, thought this is so strange that this is what comes out of me, love, something that I don't even really consider necessarily a core part of my consciousness. You know, mm-hmm. it's not like I mean, I guess it is something that's deep inside me, but it's not something that I thought was deep inside me. And it's so amazing. Mm-hmm. It's really amazing. I don't know what to say about it. You know, I part of me wants to say everyone needs to have this experience because it did something so remarkable for me, but at the same time, it is a bit of a gamble because I also had one of the most negative experiences of my life on the exact same substance. I mean, I truly believe that 5-MeO-DMT above almost anything else has something very special about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm, you know, with all the psychedelics, I've done ayahuasca maybe 17 times and, you know, Wachuma or San Pedro 7 times, a bunch of these different deep, you know, plant medicine, NN-DMT many, many times. And then doing the 5-MeO, it was almost like I remembered once again, like the awe and mystery and wow of doing a psychedelic. It was like, oh shit. You know, I had categorized it like, okay, here's a psychedelic and I'm comfortable there. And, you know, here we go trucking along. And then that hits and it's just like, what the fuck is this? This is something completely in a different realm.
Well, it really cuts to the chase.
Yeah.
In a way that other things don't. You know, I again, you know, I call it a psychedelic. I would hesitate to even use that term for it because my experience was devoid of hallucinations. What was so interesting
it was not visual.
What happened to me is I smoked the material. There's maybe a little bit of that sort of like chromatic aberration that you get on like bent or on like a cheap plastic lens where there's like a little bit of color bleeding. Then I white it out. Then it was just pure white.
I have no visual recollection of anything, which is it's super unusual. Usually like I can record all but there was literally, whited out, I guess is the right word, but I don't even remember the color white. It was like the absolute absence of any visual information. like zero. And I guess for me, I think whited out, like I'm actually looking at a white room or something with like no corners. But like I didn't see white. I didn't see black. Like if you do Iboga, like a lot of times you'll see black, and then you'll see images come into the black, and then you'll see visions. But like it'll be like looking at a seamless shoot room that's just all black, cave black or something like that. Like, okay, black, I got it. And then visions. Or white, I got that too. I've seen that, many times. This was like just no visual information, zero, no smell, no sight. I mean, there was music kind of going, as part of the ceremony that sound somehow filtered and melded into it. But it was really just a feeling. It was just like expressed through my cells in a way that I truly believe that my body couldn't create that feeling. My brain couldn't create that feeling on its own. And that, to me, made it the most otherworldly of anything else. Like I felt like it would be impossible for my machine to produce that unless I was plugged into something else.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it did things to me that I genuinely, I don't know how it's even possible for, and I'm not even sure that they're good. For example, in the maybe 10 days after the experience, had a nebulous sense of the existence of God. I'm a pretty hardcore agnostic atheist person, and I wasn't, running out to join a religion or to follow this. It was just an irrational sense, in the same way that people, just have, I suppose, irrational senses that there's people in their walls or something like that, or listening devices all over their house. It was an irrational belief in the existence of God, and I was aware that it was irrational. It wasn't logically derived.
It's irrational if you hadn't just felt what you felt. Like love and God, I think, to me, are synonyms.
But it wasn't even that. It wasn't this experience, therefore God. It was just this experience and now God, and so. And I sort of started to realize, of course, all these things are biologically and neuroanatomically mediated. And you hear these stories about someone with a tumor on their frontal cortex that suddenly becomes a pedophile, and they remove the tumor and they're not a pedophile anymore. And I had the same kind of feeling like, wow, you just introduced this chemical, this serotonergic chemical into my mind. Suddenly, I do believe in God. And then it faded after about 10 days. And now I can't even imagine what it was like. But I know for a fact that happened to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the word God has so much baggage on it. It's like whatever started as a whale is now all barnacle. And so, you're just looking at this mass and, who knows, you can't even use that word anymore.
Right. I try not to even touch it because it's also not very important to me. It's not something that I'm like struggling with religion. It's just not even that important. I'm more interested in chemistry. I don't need to deal with that. But it hit me. It hit me irrationally. Mm-hmm. And the only reason I even say it out loud is because it's, I think, a really amazing example of the power of these things to change hardened belief structures. And again, I don't know that was a positive change. It was simply a change. And if it can do that, I think that it could do all sorts of other things. In the same way that with Ibogaine, when you talk about Ibogaine, everyone says, well, that's the drug that gets heroin addicts off of heroin. Well, that's not what Ibogaine does. Ibogaine is simply so powerful that it can do that, but it can do many other things as well.
Sure.
That's just one of the most prominent examples of its power.
Yeah. Yeah, Ibogaine is an interesting one. I've done Ibogaine 3 times now, and most of the time it's the most hellish experience that I've ever had. Have you experienced that? I didn't see any. I don't know if you did an episode on it.
I've used low dose Ibogaine many times.
Yeah,
I think there was sort of a microdosing craze where everyone is using mushrooms and things like that, and I think that mushrooms are not particularly well suited to microdosing, but Ibogaine is.
I've heard that. Yeah, I've only done full flood doses, which is, it's hell. It's like truly the most hellish experience, except for the last time that I did it, and it was just like beautiful and sweet and like not somatically hellish. And the crazy thing about Ibogaine is...
And this was the Iboga bark?
Iboga bark, once extracted into, so like traditionally extracted once. And I don't know how they do that exactly.
Was this in Africa? Or?
It was in Costa Rica.
Okay.
They offer it. It's legal in like Canada, Costa Rica, a couple different places. So, and it's funny because obviously I'm not addicted to heroin, but the mental clarity that came with it, because you have, first of all, you're your heartbeat is racing a little faster. It's like a stimulant in some elements, and then a psychedelic in some elements. You probably know the pharmacological structure of it, but it hits like multiple different pathways.
Oh my God. Yeah, it is the most pharmacologically complex drug that I am aware of. There's almost nothing that it does not do.
Right.
And people call it a psychedelic, a classical psychedelic. If you actually look at the spectrum of its affinities for different receptors in the brain, its most potent affinity is for the NMDA receptor. It's more of a ketamine-type dissociative than it is a classical serotonergic psychedelic, although it also has the 5-HT2A effect. It's also a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, dopamine reuptake inhibitor. It releases this protein GDNF, which is like considered one of the most prominent therapeutic targets for treatment of Parkinson's disease. It has an impact on nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and I guarantee and then of course it has a Kappa opioid effect like Salvia, as well as a Mule opioid effect, particularly from the first pass metabolite nor Ibogaine, and I'm probably missing other ones. I mean, it does. You can barely, and it has sigma activity. You can barely name a site that this thing doesn't bind to, and so how do you even describe something like that?
It's so hard because it's doing so many things and it's so multivariant. Sometimes it's visual, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's physical. But at the end, there's nothing that feels more like a total hard reset. And I think that's why, they use it for addiction and it's so effective, because I liken it to being like an ant on a tuning fork, and like everything in your body just gets lit up to that. All the receptors gets lit up to that extreme level. And then it just kind of washes out old patterns, old psychological patterns, old physical patterns, old things that might have been stuck, and gives you an opportunity to just start clean from a fresh slate, it feels like. But it's really, really challenging, or sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's really beautiful. I remember on this last time I smelled a white rose, and it was probably the most beautiful vision I've ever seen of fractally 1 million petals unfolding from the single one of all of these roses. And I was there with this bird's eye view of 1 million petals unfolding in this fractal rose flower as I smelled the scent, and the scent turned into the vision, and it permeated the entire space. Like, that was pretty fucking beautiful. But every time is just different depending on where you are, what material it is, what state you're in. You'll never be able to line it up exactly right and recreate the same thing.
Yeah, it's really, really amazing stuff. I would, I think I, like many people, sort of dismissed it based on thinking that it was this drug for opioid addicts, and thinking, well, I don't have any use of opioids. I don't have any problems with opioids. It's not my thing. I don't need to use that. And then started talking with more and more people about it, and realized that's just the tip of the iceberg. You can use this for all sorts of things. They were trying to use it as a performance-enhancing drug for athletes in Canada. And I knew a bodybuilder in New York who used to take Ibogaine when he was working out at the gym, and I thought that was so hilarious that he would take Ibogaine and use anabolic steroids, and it just seemed like the most obscure, ridiculous thing to do. Who would ever do that? And now I totally get it. I totally understand where he's coming from, because it gives you power. It gives you a sense of physical fortitude and strength that will help any person who's struggling with almost anything, whether it's neurodegenerative disease, opioid addiction, whatever.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things to remember, a lot of the people who've had bad experiences, because I've heard of people, going into a coma. I've heard of people having some really challenging experiences with Iboga, is minimum effective dose. You know what I mean? Like, always be careful, minimum effective dose. You don't need a fucking massive flood dose like you've experimented with. Try the microdose first.
Right.
Chill.
And the issue with the flood dose is it's necessitated by prohibition. So, our current treatment paradigm is you're addicted to heroin or whatever, and you realize there's a problem. I've got to stop. I need a solution. So what do? I go to an Ibogaine clinic in Canada or in Mexico. Mm-hmm. But you live in the United States, so you're not going to live there. So you want to get the most bang for your buck. You're only there for 3 days. Give me a flood dose. Give me as much as possible, and then I'm going back to where I came from. But that's not the ideal situation at all. You want to have support after the experience, and you want to have the ability to use it again periodically to help you if the cravings return. I mean, I think that that this flood dose paradigm is a product of prohibition more than anything else, and that if people could do it in a more responsible way, it would be lower dose, which is safer, because there's a Oh, that's the other receptor that it hits, unfortunately, is the HERG channel. There's a voltage-gated potassium ion channel that regulates the rhythm of the heart, and it blocks that channel and causes arrhythmias, and that's what's responsible for the cardiotoxicity of Ibogaine. Well, it's a dose-dependent problem. The less you take, the less likely you are to suffer arrhythmias. So again, you can avoid that problem by not doing these flood doses. And that's not to say that there isn't something to these flood doses. I've never had one, so I can't speak to that. But I know that in Gabon, in the Bwiti religion, that's something you do once in your life. That's, they call it breaking open the head. That's an initiation ritual that you do once, maybe twice. And then after that, it's all low dose. So, I think that's something that...
Yeah, I think like the literal max that anybody ever does is like 5 times in a life. That's like for the shaman.
Yeah.
Will take 5 flood doses in their whole lifetime. Whereas like a San Pedro shaman or an ayahuasca shaman might drink thousands of cups.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just a different ball game.
Yeah,
for sure. And I think, it is, I think you make a good point about the reaction from this prohibitionary world. Like we've had, it's actually the same with drinking. I think even binge drinking amongst 18 to 21-year-olds, if you look statistically, a lot of that is due to the prohibition of alcohol for that age group. You get it. You want to get as fucked up as possible because you're not supposed to be doing it, and you want to get the most experience you can, rather than if you're in Europe and you can just have a glass of wine and drink like a normal person.
There's no rush.
There's no rush. You don't have to they don't have all these beer bongs and fucking, shotgunning beers and all this stuff elsewhere. Not nearly as much because you're just around it, and it's just you can naturally and healthily assimilate it into your life rather than, run into Amsterdam and eating fucking 10 grams of truffles or something like that, because, it's legal now.
Right, exactly. And it creates this, this sort of paternalistic government creates the illusion that it's protecting us in some way. So you think, okay, like these things are illegal because they're dangerous, but as soon as they're legal, then they're not dangerous anymore. The opposite is also true. So you'll hear this ridiculous misconception that because something is not illegal in the United States, it must be safe. We need to get out of that mentality of legality having anything to do with pharmacology or toxicology. The two are totally separate.
I mean, ideally they wouldn't be totally separate, but in the world we're in, they fucking for sure are.
Well, I mean, it's like, maybe the government thinks they are because they would assume that alcohol is like not toxic and that LSD is, but they're just,
Yeah, I mean the fact that marijuana is Schedule 1 and hydrocodone and Percocet are not, and they're available. Like obviously when you look at the amount of deaths associated, the overdoses associated, come on.
Yeah.
Come on. Let's get real here and see that there's something in the system that's not actually accurately talking about what's happening.
Well, the whole scheduling system is just a total disaster, and I think a lot of it has to do with people not taking responsibility for themselves. Right now there's an enormous amount of news coverage of the opioid epidemic in the United States, and a typical attitude to have toward this epidemic is to wag your finger at pharmaceutical companies, wag your finger at doctors, and say that it's their fault that this or that is happening. But I think we have to get out of this mindset of blaming other people for our problems with drugs because, if you want freedom, if the goal of this game is to be free, then you have to take responsibility for yourself. You have to stop blaming other people.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So we've talked a lot about, both of us have had an incredibly positive experience with psychedelics, but I think it's worthwhile to just put this caveat out there. Like it is always playing with fire, and it is always super important that you're being as careful as possible, choosing the right dose, the right time, with the right people surrounding you, and just be extra careful, extra responsible. And if you're not called to it, you don't feel like you really want to do it, don't do it. Don't do it to show off. Don't do it for like a badge of honor. You don't get your fucking ayahuasca Eagle Scout badge for just doing it, Like wait till it's really the right time in the right place.
Right. If not even for your sake, for everyone else, because you can ruin it for everybody by behaving irresponsibly. That sort of thing happens with drugs all the time. One person that makes a dumb mistake with some obscure chemical like 2-CT7, and then scientists can't research it potentially ever again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not just about you. it's about the rest of us trying to take drugs too, and I think that's important. So what's next for you, man? More episodes? Is there more things to explore? What's coming up?
Yeah, the show did really well. Both the first and second seasons were the most watched show on Viceland. So people really, I think, have an appetite for this sort of material. People are really curious about these things and they want to learn more. And there's a part of me that would love to do it forever. I was offered a third season. I have declined at this point because I want to make a movie now, but and I want to write and focus on some other things. But I may do a third season or may do a one-off thing at some point in the future. But I'll always be interested in this subject, and I'll always be doing lab work as well and contributing to this world in any way that I can.
Yeah. Well, coming from a fan, you're the perfect fucking guy for the job, cool. And watching you go through all of these experiences with this kind of very unbiased and yet courageous and open-minded way that you went through it, I think it's done the world a lot of good, man. And I really appreciate you for that. And I'm really fucking glad you undertook this journey in whatever way or shape or form, that first good Salvia experience maybe that set you on the path or whatever that was. I think we're all grateful that it took you that way.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Anything, where can people find you? Anything you want to point out too besides the episode?
Yeah, a lot of people have trouble finding my show, but it's easy to stream on Amazon and iTunes. I really recommend watching the first and second season of Hamilton's Pharmacopeia, the TV show, as opposed to the material that's freely available on YouTube, simply because it's better production value, more work went into it. I'm more proud of it. I think it's better work. So that would be what I recommend everybody start with.
Yep.
And if you're interested in the science, I periodically publish scientific articles in peer-reviewed journals, and you can check that out as well, although it might be a little bit dry for most people.
Do you think there's still undiscovered compounds that could have really significant, benefit?
Absolutely. 100%. I think it might take a while to discover them, but you look at a structure like Ibogaine, something like DMT, it's a simple derivative of tryptophan. That maybe humans would discover. In fact, they did discover it before they ever found it in nature. But Ibogaine, there's no way we would have discovered that. The same is true of the lysergamide backbone of LSD. There's no way we would have discovered that intricate structure. So there's so many things to be discovered in the natural world still. There was a salvinorin A type chemical that was isolated from a type of mushroom called Rhodocalibia maculata. This could be a new psychedelic. No one's ever tried it other than mice. There's all sorts of things in the ocean that haven't been adequately tested. And on top of that, there's chemists around the world exploring the structure-activity relationship of, these known scaffolds for psychedelic drugs like the salvinorin A type compounds, phenethylamines, tryptamines, and so on. So there's no question new things will be discovered.
Do you think that what do you think about like direct neuromanipulation, like through other means, like non-ingestible, but like just basically altering the neurochemistry through that, kind of God helmet concept? What do you give credence to that idea?
I've never done it myself. I've certainly read about it. It's funny because when people talk about, transcranial electromagnetic stimulation or something like that, it's always considered very high tech. Like, it's so high tech, we're using magnets to create a drug experience. I think drugs are high tech. I think that is the ultimate technology. We're building little tiny carbon sculptures that are able to enter your body and bind to these receptors in the brain. What could be more amazing than that? It's nanotechnology. There's nothing even close to that. So maybe we'll achieve something like this with a magnet or electrodes or whatever. But, plants figured it out. Drugs are a really good way of doing this, and I believe always will be.
Plants are a technology already.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Amen to that. All right, my brother. Thanks for jumping on the show. That was awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.